My name's Peter May, and I'd like, if I may, just to add a few comments from a general practice perspective. Problems with sexuality are a significant part of a family doctor's workload. One is always learning new things about the human condition. And early on in my career, I came across a man who was a spanker. The idea of spanking for sexual delight eluded me. I've never suffered from it myself, so I phoned a psychiatrist for advice about this man. And he said to me in words that have remained etched on my brain, "In my experience, once a spanker, always a spanker." So having tasted the delights of spanking, he would not be able to put that particular genie back in the bottle. More commonly, I had patients who were caught up with adulterous desires, and making a break from them was very difficult. In the passage of time, their memory would be dulled as to why this other person was so attractive to them, but only if they remained apart. Put them together again, whether in a work situation or in a social context, and it all came flooding back. The smile, the gestures, the voice, to say nothing of the pulsating figure. They flooded back into mind, and the old flames were reignited as vigorously as ever. A variation on this phenomenon occurred sufficiently often that I found myself anticipating what the patient was going to say next. These invariably female patients attended usually on a Monday morning. They had a history of a relationship that had broken up years ago, often very bitterly. Perhaps he was unfaithful or violent or bullying, but she was very relieved to be shot of him. He was a bad egg. And yet on perhaps Saturday morning, she bumped into him again by chance in the centre of town. And they chatted together. And then they went for coffee. And I started to click in. I know where this is going. I don't know why, she would say, but I invited him back home for lunch. And then the tears would flow. Surprise, surprise, he stayed the night, they slept together, and now she bitterly regretted it. She couldn't understand what made her do it. And then there was a man who about twice a year would use a prostitute, and he hated himself for it. But his regret would last for some 6 months, and then once again the desires would overwhelm him. And many people feel like this about pornography. They hate its addictive power over their lives. And paedophilia has a similar stranglehold on people. And others are distressed by recurrent homosexual desires, which may or may not ever be acted upon. Now, the common feature of all these behaviors is that initially these sexual activities are overwhelmingly delightful, such as the thrill and the reward that they couldn't forget it. And they found these desires very easy to reignite. So these people came to me in their first instance for counselling and for help, and I could refer them on to our practice counsellor. None of these folk were ever cured of their desires. The NHS has no magical technique to erase the memory or to reprogram the neurophysiological mechanisms that trigger our sexual responses. Now, I draw two conclusions from this. The first is that all highly pleasurable sexual activities are profoundly addictive. None of them can be cured, but they can all, by degree, to some extent, be managed albeit with difficulty, using various counselling approaches, including cognitive behavioural therapy, to help them to regain some control of their lives. And secondly, they raise serious questions about the nature of orientations. Is paedophilia an orientation? Is spanking? Is pornography? Or is it much more helpful to consider sexual desires as a very powerful force that any of us can inflame and channel into all sorts of highly addictive and enjoyable activities? In the combined statement of the counselling bodies that Dermot has discussed, and you have in the packs, they say that they have a researched and informed understanding of sexual orientation. And they conclude it's not an illness, and therefore it's logically and ethically flawed to offer any kind of treatment. Dermot has highlighted the nonsense of this for all the other things that they do offer treatment for, such as bereavement, which are not illnesses as far as I understand. Now, this rigid view of orientation is itself deeply flawed. In April, the Royal College of Psychiatrists, as we've been told, in the light of complaints of Dermot and myself, have modified their statement on homosexuality. They now admit that people are not born gay, and neither is their orientation fixed. What was going on in their thinking that they needed an engineer to point that out to them? And they now admit there is significant fluidity, and that people can and do change their orientation during the course of their lives. Yet the same statement repeats this narrow and rigid view of orientation, which is totally at sea with reality. There are according to them, three distinct orientations. You're either homosexual, or you're bisexual, or you're heterosexual. And only bisexuals, they claim, have any degree of choice in the matter. Tosh. These writers need to get out more. Lisa Diamond, a researcher from Utah, makes the point that these rigid views of orientation derive from small, non-random, self-selected people who then get asked the wrong questions. These studies are not done on the population at large. If you only did research into homosexuality on volunteers from a gay pride march, you'd get a very distorted picture of the reality, the larger reality that is out there. To find out what really goes on, you need to visit the large representative surveys. Now, these show that in this matter, anyway, Kinsey was right, and sexual desires exist across a spectrum, from exclusively heterosexual at one end to exclusively homosexual at the other. And the exclusive group at the homosexual end of the spectrum is surprisingly small. Some 2.5% of men claim to be exclusively gay. Lisa Diamond's research found that even a significant proportion of the 2.5%, when asked directly, admitted having sexual desires and even sexual activity with members of the opposite sex. So her conclusion is that fluidity in the way people identify themselves, the attractions they endure and experience, and the behavior they engage in, fluidity is a general feature of human sexuality. So the Royal College continues to propagate gay ideology rather than science in what it says about orientation. And once you face the realities of sexual fluidity, it's nonsense to ban therapy from people who are struggling with unwanted sexual desires. Furthermore, they have an ethical responsibility to respect both the wishes and the beliefs of their patients, and not impose a gay ideology upon them. And as for the risk of harm, we say in medicine that every treatment that has an effect has a side effect. You only have to look in your packet of paracetamol to read the warnings that there is some risk of harm taking paracetamol. And some risks are very small and they're worth taking. And finally, I must respond to their statement that homosexuality is compatible with normal mental health. But they make no mention of the mental stresses caused by the physical illnesses that are common in the gay community. It's like saying that survival is compatible with jumping out of a first-floor window. It is. But what are the risks? And here, what are the risks entailed by homosexual behavior? Surely they have a public health responsibility to highlight those risks. Besides the well-documented risks of anxiety, neurosis, depression and suicide in the gay community, which GPs are all too aware of as they, for the most part, have to manage the patient through these difficulties, it is well documented that men who have sex with men have vastly increased physical illnesses, not least in contracting sexually transmitted infections. They have 50 times the risk of heterosexuals to contract syphilis and 50 times the risk of contracting gonorrhea, seemingly due to the vulnerability of the gossamer-thin lining of the rectum. And what about HIV? I was in discussion recently with an inner London GP, and I said that it's estimated that 10% of gays nationally are HIV positive, but it's thought that it's probably 20% in London. What did he think? He went quiet before speaking, and then he said, "No, I think that's quite wrong. I'm thinking through my own patients. Quite a number of them are gay, but I cannot think of any one of them who is not HIV positive. It must be higher than 20% in London." The UK has the fastest growing epidemic of HIV in Europe. The figures for 2012 showed that there are 77,000 people in the UK that are being treated currently with antiviral therapy. A website said recently that in the UK, late diagnosis can increase the risk of death from AIDS tenfold. And in 2012, 47% of HIV diagnoses were late diagnoses. I was going to say something about the cost, but I've been encouraged to move on. I do want to flag up one particular issue, though. I am particularly concerned for adolescents embarking on high-risk behaviour, who are being taught in school, not least because of the college statement, that homosexuality is normal and healthy. So I was interested to find these figures from the Centre of Disease Control in America. Now, maths isn't my strong suit, so I forwarded these figures to two numerate professors and asked them to calculate the relative risk of adolescent gays compared with their heterosexual peers in contracting HIV. Adolescents seen here at 13 to 24, which I think is about what adolescent behaviour indicates. They both replied within 15 minutes that on the basis of these figures, assuming gays to be 2% of the male population, the risk of HIV infection is 1,088 times greater amongst gay adolescents. Now, these are public health figures the nation needs to face up to. It is only gay ideology that makes the Royal College issue an unqualified statement that homosexuality is compatible with normal health. These statistics provide very strong grounds for men with unwanted same-sex desires to seek help in controlling them. Thank you.